Hello, everyone. You are at the panel about house bands, and we're going to quickly introduce ourselves first.
I'm Kevin Bunch. I run Atari Archive. You may have seen me at the panel directly preceding this one.
What? And I'm Brian Clark. I'm a writer, translator, video maker guy who runs 1millionpower.com. And if you like this, you may also like Gameplay Harmony is the book that I have a few copies of and is also on sale at the Enerjax booth in the vendor hall if anyone wants to check that out. And the theme of this episode is house bands, but we kind of did a version of this already because it was a Retronauts episode. Thank you, Dio.
Yes, I'm one of the rotating hosts for Retronauts, and we did an episode on house bands earlier this year. It was a Patreon exclusive, if I remember, so if you're not subscribed, you may not have heard it. But good news, we have a panel. We
are able to go into a little bit more depth than we will here because we had a little bit more time. So if this is not enough for you, then maybe consider checking that one out. But the first ground we want to cover here is, broadly speaking, what is a house band? Well, it is a band that plays music generally for a specific game company, recording studio, establishment, that sort of thing, playing more or less only the music featured in games from that company. And for game companies, they tended to consist of game music composition staff, though not always, as you'll see. And this seems to have been more or less a Japanese thing. If anybody is aware of any examples to the contrary, maybe let us know later. But so far as we know, there are no examples of this outside of Japanese game companies. Midway wasn't getting out there and touring around the country for like the music for NBA Jam or anything.
Oh man, imagine Marble Madness concerts. These were used primarily as a promotional aid for these companies and their video games, particularly in the wake of musician Haruomi Hosono's 1984 album Video Game
Here it
Music,
is.
as you can see up there on the screen. This was followed by the creation of the GMO label by Yellow Magic Orchestra, game music orchestra, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
But they were known. These house bands. They're generally known for their game compositions. Sometimes they're credited entirely as the band for game soundtracks. So like if you buy a game soundtrack album, say Gradius 3, it'll be credited to Konami Kukeha Club.
Yeah.
And sometimes they did live performances too, as we'll also get into if we have time.
Yep, and generally speaking, like this got started because game music was evolving to the point where like a more complex sound seemed necessary, at least for arcade titles specifically, since at this point like the hardware was so much higher above what you could find in a home for arcade titles that they just sort of needed to make the experience more impactful, right? And good FM synth sound was becoming more common, both in arcades and in Japanese PC hardware, and so they felt like they had to do more with that FM synth sound to sort of more accurately represent the sound of real instruments.
Yeah, it's really fun looking through some of these interviews from the mid-'80s when these were first starting to take off. And you have these composers talking about how much they hate working on the Famicom versus working on FM synth hardware.
Yeah.
And game music was becoming more popular in Japan. The video game music album and the GMO releases, those were all selling reasonably well. So there was a market for it. This was the era of the bubble economy in Japan, so people were throwing around money on all sorts of weird stuff. So circa 1988, this really blew up as a whole thing through the early 90s.
Yeah.
Let's get into the first of the bands.
It was just like Yakuza 0, if anyone's played that, where you punch people and money just comes flying out of them. That was incredibly accurate to reality. So speaking of Sega, our first band here is SST, Sega Sound Team, which is probably the best known out of all these bands, I feel like, maybe. Okay, well, we can have that debate in a little bit here.
Either or.
But they seem to have sort of, if only by a little, been the first one to form. And the first iteration and we kind of have introductions to all these bands, like names, and I should say just sort of a blanket statement for all these bands is they often went through many, many members over time. So like what you see here is not necessarily every member throughout history. Often they'll be like the most iconic lineups or the final lineups in the case of SST here. But the first iteration of SST came in December 1987 for an event called Afterburner Panic, which is what I experience every single time that I play Afterburner. And it was to promote the arcade release of Afterburner at Ikebukuro Sunshine City in Tokyo, which is a giant like shopping area, which is still there now, though I don't think they have too many Sega events there anymore. And members of Sega's sound team were brought in to kind of, jazz up the promotion for Afterburner, and this was just kind of the first instance in which they all played together in a live setting. And so they officially debuted as SST in 1988 with the release of Galaxy Force GSM Sega 1 is when they officially started calling themselves SST. And they consisted of 6 members of Sega's sound team. And though their first live performance under this name wouldn't be until 1989, the lineup remained the same. And in 1989, that event was called Mega Drive Sparkling 1989. So we keep coming with the great titles there. And I would say they're almost exclusively focused on arrangements and live performances of Sega's arcade soundtracks. Not explicitly all arcade soundtracks, but by and large, especially at the beginning there.
Like 90%.
Yeah, exactly. You'll see them get into consoles every once in a while, but it's a little bit more few and far between. And their arrangements tend to be maybe a little bit more straightforward than some of the groups that we'll be getting into later. Just sort of like very guitar and synth heavy. And as they go on, I feel like, we'll talk about this for a minute, as they transition from SST into Blind Spot, they just get more and more shreddy. Like you just get more and more long guitar solos as time goes on. And they actually disbanded as SST in 1993, supposedly due to issues with like Sega's internal record label changing and them not really being able to support that anymore. And then in 2011, they regrouped as Blind Spot with initially at least essentially the same lineup, and they still did Sega music and everything. I'm not sure what kind of deal they had worked out with Sega behind the scenes, but it was almost like nothing really had even changed, right? And the last album that they put out as SST was also called Blind Spot, which is probably where that naming came from, I'm assuming. We'll actually, throughout some of this, we'll actually be playing like some video footage underneath that as well, just so you can kind of see what they were like on stage, because this is something we were not able to do on an audio podcast.
Despite our best efforts.
Exactly, yes. And the band has gone through a bunch of different iterations over the years, as I mentioned. So, like, you might have seen that lineup that I had on screen earlier and been like, hey, what about so-and-so? They were a key member of the band. So we'll just mention a couple of those people. Takenobu Mitsuyoshi, everyone's favorite singing salaryman, used to be with them for a while. Though none of the recorded footage really has him in it. It's strange. And Hiroshi Kawaguchi, like essentially one of Sega's first composers, was also kind of an early member as well, though they sort of fell off in the early days to, make room for what the lineup actually really would end up being. And later on, though not at first, they even had vocals on their songs from time to time. Later, after they became Blind Spot, Kobayashi Kaede was the lady who did a lot of their vocals on the songs that had them. Unfortunately, though, Blind Spot did dissolve fairly recently in 2021. They played one final show that consisted of 2 nights at Blue Mood in Tokyo's Tsukiji, and it featured like a bunch of their past members and their current members throughout both of those nights. They unfortunately did not stream that, and when I asked Namiki why on Twitter, he told me Sega did not allow it. So, yep, it's unfortunate. And then some of these members just kind of went on to form their own solo projects, which they're still doing today. Bassist Masato Saito formed his own band almost immediately after, calling it very on the nose Saito Turbo Masato's project Hitori SST, which is like SST by myself, even though he had it was not literally just him like one man banding it up on stage. Like he had other people, but he was the only person in that group from the original SST lineup. And then kind of the group leader Koichi Namiki, who is one of the guitarists, also released some solo material and has a project called Kumanami, and they've actually rehashed a bunch of SST stuff in like slightly different arrangements over time. And former drummer Hisanori Kumamaru is the other sort of the Kuma half of Kumanami, who is the original drummer. And other similar projects have happened over the years within Sega, like Namiki and Takenobu Mitsuyoshi had a short-lived duo called B-Univ that did like some Virtua Fighter stuff and Virtua Racing and things like that. Takenobu Mitsuyoshi has H period, which is an SEO nightmare to search for anything on that group. I don't think they've done anything recently, but that was in 2001. And their encore is always Afterburner, pretty much every single time. Like, Afterburner is pretty much what they're known for. And they've done songs, Galaxy Force, Outrun, Super Hang On. You saw Power Drift there at the end, which is one of my favorites, because if you saw it, like, I've never seen two guitar players look like they were having more fun on stage in my life than those two were playing Like the Wind from Power Drift. And you heard Space Harrier before that. And yeah, that's SST, So
now we get to move on to the other big name that everybody loves, Zuntata. This was Taito's house band. They have a very eclectic range of musical stylings and compositions depending on the game and what their lineup is. But generally they're very avant-garde, I guess is the best way of putting it. They're very good at very dreamlike soundscapes. So this name was first used circa 1988 when Ninja Warriors came out in arcades,
yes.
Although they were also credited as Zuntata on the 1987 album Darius Taito Game Music Volume 2. Darius, there you go, not Darius. We're reading out the kana here. So their concerts, they're very they were the most frequent, I'd argue. They're generally very interesting. They do a lot of really interesting instrumentation. Their first live show in 1990 had a whole horn section, full horn section. Later 90s performances, they'd have various members rotating in and out. One of my favorite things is them bringing in a shamisen player to play the Daddy Mulk from Ninja Warriors. A song that is not very friendly to shamisen in real life when you're not just doing it on a computer keyboard. It
was not written by a person who actually knew how to play the shamisen.
Yeah, so God bless that man for being able to actually play that. So yeah, they formed into a full band in 1990 after Pony Canyon, which was that label behind the album. They were preparing for an SST band release, and they asked Taito's people if Zuntata would be interested in doing live shows as well. So there's been a ton of members of the lineup over the years, both for the live shows and behind the scenes. I feel like maybe one of the most well-known members is OGR, Hisayoshi Ogura. He did Darius 1 and 2, Darius Gaiden, G Darius, Ninja Warriors. He really seemed to like that sort of avant-garde soundscape, and I think he was sort of the present force for that in their work. There's also Tamayo,
who you're seeing right now.
Yep, known for the Ray series of games, Ray Force, Ray Crisis, Ray Storm, not in that order. There's Mar Period, known for Night Striker, Ray Maze, Rastan Saga, Gamera 2000, all great soundtracks. Nakayama Raiden, also a great handle, let me tell you. Known for Densha De Go, Grid Seeker, Bubble Bobble 2, and Yak, known for Metal Black, Civilian, or Civiline, I don't know how you pronounce that.
Civilian, I think.
Something. And Kaiser Knuckle, which is, their great fighting game with the general in it. Most of their members, they left in 2005 when Taito got swallowed up by Square Enix. into that whole conglomerate blob. But Zuntata does still exist. They do compose music for Taito's occasional releases. They did the menu music for the Egret 2 Mini. They've done music for Groove Coaster, a lot of mobile games. They do hold events, if not concerts, in Tokyo still. Not necessarily like Taito's own arcades.
Yeah, they have a regular streaming program that they do once every month.
Zuntata Nights.
Yeah. They aren't necessarily live musical performances, though sometimes they are. They're generally kind of like talk events, but every once in a while they will do music stuff. But there's a lot of like Zuntata history, like if you can parse the Japanese, like one that I was able to go to a few years ago, like they showed like photos of like old like Taito company IDs and things like that of some of the Zuntata people. It was fun.
So yeah, if you're ever in Tokyo, check and see if they're doing anything at the Taito Megarage arcade in Mizunokuchi, Kawasaki.
It's a mouthful.
I'm gonna trip over my words here. And now we have something completely different.
Yes, very, very much something completely different. So this is, I feel like, maybe one that people are most likely to have not heard of if you were going to not hear of one of them. Gamadelic was actually Data East's house band, who I feel like did not get quite as much traction as some of the others did. I'd say probably best known for soundtracks to things like Windjammers, Magical Drop. Like Windjammers is very likely the place you would have heard them if you've heard them anywhere. And they had some earlier stuff like Vapor Trail, Kuga, Fighter's History, specifically Karnov's Revenge, they started a little bit later than most of the other bands. They started in like 1990 with the release of the Glory of Hercules 2 soundtrack album. Followed by Live Vapor Trail soundtrack, which actually we've got a performance of Vapor Trail here with
great song.
It's their little intro I put at the beginning here. There you go. And I think they're playing with Namiki here from SST. I'm pretty sure who that is. With this weird ponytail. But they wound down around 1997. This Data East sound staff kind of left the company. Though I'm not sure exactly what year it was. They do still sort of exist today as Gamadelic. They release something from time to time. It's like a lot of the old members and whatnot.
Yeah, I think they reformed in 2013. I
think so. And they sort of have different names for themselves depending on how many of the original members they have. Superdelic, things like this. So they make it nice and confusing to like find what their entire catalog is. Yeah, they reformed around 2013. Karnov, there he is. Yeah, but in 2013 they actually did a tribute live at a venue in Shibuya, and like they've done Tokyo Game Show appearances and stuff over the years. Kogedelic when they don't have their full roster, Gamadelic 3 when they're a 3-piece band. And at least back in the day, as you can kind of see with this, they were very much more kind of comedic than the rest of the bands were. Like you've got this goofy stuff happen with Karnov is coming to town here. But they ran the gamut from like you saw this to like Vapor Trail, which was like a very straightforward rock song. So they kind of went all over the place. And sort of as a case in point, like they had their leader motto, their gimmick was that he was a space alien from planet Dolaron here to conquer the Earth, which I don't think he was ever actually able to achieve, but good on him for trying. And they had a lot more vocals, I would say, than a lot of the other songs do. Like you heard it in Karnov. They used to have sort of a rapper in their group back in the day. And playing at the beginning here was the song from the RoboCop game called Walk Like Super Cop, which is a favorite of mine. All right.
I feel like in the good timeline, Mauro took over the world. And
yeah.
We're all much better off.
Yeah, we might be better off.
But we didn't like Gamadelic enough, so we've screwed ourselves.
For it.
So this is Elf Lila. This is Capcom's house band. They were first credited as Elf Lila Walila in the 1988 album Capcom Game Music, volumes 2 and 3. Those were produced under the GMO label. They had arranged performances of the soundtracks from Rockman and Higemaru Makajima. Sorry, I'm trying to read on a phone. Should probably zoom in a little more. Most of the members of the Elf Lila were women. They didn't have any male members until 1991. But we have some among the members of note, because they did also go through quite a few changes over the years.
There's a couple major ones who aren't in this photo, and honestly, like, you can't really find a photo with like every single of the key members together. At least I couldn't, so I picked one who I was able to identify everyone in, but we'll mention some names here that.
But yeah, some of these notable folks, you may have heard of some of them. We have Tamayo Kawamoto. She's on the picture.
Who you just saw from Zuntata just a few moments ago.
She did later on go to Zuntata, but she was one of Capcom's earliest hired musicians. She's known for doing the soundtracks to Sun, Commando, Section Z, and Ghouls and Ghosts, among others. There's Yoko Shimomura,
who's not pictured, unfortunately.
You may know as the GOAT. She did Street Fighter II's soundtrack album at the time with Elf Lila, and they got a lot of traction out of that, let me tell you. Quite a few albums. Manami Matsumae, who did the soundtrack to the first Mega Man game, UN Squadron, Magic Sword, Junko Tamiya, Bionic Commando's NES soundtrack, Strider, Sweet Home, bunch of other stuff. Harumi Fujita did the arcade soundtrack to Bionic Commando, and she also worked on Strider. She later went off from Capcom. She did the soundtrack to Polestar on the Neo Geo. So the name came from 1001 Nights, which is why they have sort of a Middle Eastern look to their original logo.
Yeah.
Which,
some of their songs are even vaguely sort of. I don't think I have like the original logo in here.
Yeah, I don't see it on there, but you can look it up somewhere. So yeah, mostly known for their Street Fighter II arrangements, as you can hear. There's no video of any of their live performances.
Unfortunately, yeah, I wasn't really able to find anything, and I didn't have anything myself. And then instead, you get some bonus photos of them.
But yeah, their live performances, it was mostly they're all female lineups, although even after they had some male members in Elf Lila, they stayed behind the scenes, if you will. But they did a lot of interesting albums. There's like there's a Rockman X album that's just kind of like jazzy.
Yeah,
it's kind of cool. Captain Commando with like a vocal song.
That's what opened the sound roll we had earlier.
And like a million different Street Fighter II albums in basically any style you can think of. They also were reportedly credited for the arranged BGM soundtrack to the PC Engine CD release Sidearm Special. I've only seen this in the Japanese Wikipedia article to the band. Excuse me. And it has a very like CPS2-ish sound, so I kind of see it. They're also credited for the song Break on the Street Fighter II animated movie soundtrack. And yeah, they seem to have faded out in the mid-90s as the members left Capcom and the name started being used less often as well. I think the last album that actually used the Elf Lila name came out in 1988, and it was like a Street Fighter Alpha like compilation or something.
Next we have Konami Kukeha Club, also sort of known as Hardy Music Club Band, which I will explain in a bit. This one's a little bit confusing if you're researching it, because Konami Kukeha Club is just the name of their sound department in general, but Kukeha Club, which actually uses a different set of characters, is their actual band, so it makes it horrible to do research on this. But they were originally formed in 1987 as Konami Kuke Club, obviously to carry out band duties, because at the time there was no real distinction between their internal sound team and the band, which sort of happened a little bit later. And at this time, the GMO music label released Konami Game Freaks as their first work. And then when we came around to like 1990, that distinction really started happening when they actually had their own self-titled debut album. And as we'll hear in the live footage that I go to in just a minute, it's very... Their actual albums, though they've done some game soundtracks, their actual self-titled albums are not game music particularly. It's just very very Cassiopeia-inspired kind of like jazz fusion. And Cassiopeia, if we mentioned YMO, Yellow Magic Orchestra earlier, but like if you don't know Cassiopeia, like I'd argue they were just as influential to game music of this period, honestly, if not more so than YMO was. But yeah, at times it just sort of seems like you're listening to them, which I'll kind of put this on here so you can sort of get an idea here. And they had an absolute ton of members over the years, so we couldn't mention them all here, but you had like Michel Furukawa, Motoaki Furukawa, who is the guitarist and leader and is still around in their the new version of this, who did things like Gradius 2, both the arcade and the unrelated MSX game, Super Contra, Sunset Riders. You had the Story Morimoto, Yukie Morimoto, who is the keyboardist. He did things like Pop and Twinbee, the Famicom and Super Famicom Gradius 2 and 3, Tiny Toon Adventures on the Super Famicom, Ganbare Goemon 3. He contributed to Castlevania 3. Funa-chan, Jun Funahashi, who was also keyboards, did stuff like Bayou Billy, Castlevania 3, Twinbee 3, Tiny Toons Famicom, the TMNT, the first TMNT game on the NES.
It's a real murderer's row.
It's crazy.
Musicians on here.
And their band mascot was Kukeha, Soundwave Kun, who you're actually you'll see it in the next thing when the thing is done. But he's sort of like a square. He's got a square wave haircut. I'll actually go back. Well, I'll go back to it here real quick in a minute. And their Gradius 3 soundtrack actually debuted at number 26 on the Oricon charts, which is kind of nuts for a game music CD, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many other game soundtracks showed up on the Oricon.
There can't have been many. Maybe Dragon Quest, but like it's their pop music charts. It's like the Billboard. So like that a game music soundtrack came up there is crazy. And they handled all the music for Konami's TV commercials too, interestingly. And they disbanded in 2003 when Furukawa left Konami, and sort of the original members also trickled out there. And they retired the Kukeha club name entirely by the end of 1996 in their soundtracks. And sort of the success of like the Bimani, the Konami Bimani brand sort of resulted in them moving away from, the old way of doing things into the new way of doing things, right? And so you can kind of see a square wave haircut there down at the bottom. But then, they sort of kind of exist now as Hardy Music Club Band. It's like 3 of the same members plus some additional people. So they still live on in some way.
And, I'm just saying MAGFest should totally get them for one of these shows. Yeah, I can't make it happen, but someone should. Whoever watches this to make sure it goes up on YouTube.
Please.
So this next one is the SNK sound team, the Shin Sekai Gakyoku Zatsugidan. So this is their SNK's internal music team going back all the way to the pre-Neo Geo era from the 80s, referred to as the Neo Sound Orchestra as well. So this one is really tricky to track down members for because it's sort of built differently from all the ones we've seen so far. So back in the 90s, the way they did things is that the composer would compose the soundtrack to the video game, right? And then they would be responsible for also composing an arranged soundtrack that could be used for like the Neo Geo CD and for standalone albums.
This is the most convoluted system I feel like that anyone has out of this whole list of bands.
So then they had session musicians come in to actually record it, right? And they did a similar approach for their live performances once they started doing those, where the hired professional musicians, played the music that had been laid out and composed by the composer. It's truly insane, but their music is like top notch, probably my favorite out of here. The band portion, they seem to have formed around 1994 for live performances, but it's really unclear if they did any more than one or two from the game music festivals.
Yeah.
So this obviously disbanded when SNK went into bankruptcy in 2001. Though some of the members did come back to SNK Playmore when that formed up a little while later. And today, SNK has a new sound team working on current games. You were seeing them right here. They're credited under the same name, the SNK, Sound Orchestra, and they do sometimes do performances. They've done virtual ones, they've done live ones. They performed at Taito Station, Mizoguchi in 2018. They did a virtual concert in 2019, they did a virtual concert for EVO 2022, and they did a live show in 2019 for the King of Festival. So it took them a while, but they finally came around to the same system everyone else uses. If you've been keeping up with their new City of the Wolves release, they've been doing albums for that, they've been doing songs for that.
Tracks, here and there.
Yeah, they've been posting up the songs for that on the web recently. These days they do lean more towards a heavier rock styling, but like for the Samurai Showdown 2019 album, they had all sorts of different stylings. And you go back to the 90s stuff, they're all over the map.
Oh, yeah.
They have a very interesting library of music. And yeah, great arrangements. I definitely recommend checking out their arranged soundtracks.
Oh yeah, even the old arranged soundtracks are amazing under their convoluted system or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we'll move on.
And I'm wearing the Geese Howard shirt, so
yeah.
I'm right here.
All right, so JDK heads will have to forgive me because JDK has had a billion members over the years, and I'm not as familiar with them as I am with some of these other bands. So I had to find a picture in which members were identified for me, and this is probably not even close to being current, but it's what I could do.
They're kind of fascinating too, because like all the ones we've looked at now have been mostly like coin-op companies, and Falcom is very much a computer game company.
They very much are. And they were founded in 1988 by Meiko Ishikawa, originally just called JDK before being renamed in 1990. Their initial album, I think their first couple of albums are just JDK and not JDK Band. Of course, they still compose music for Falcom right now, and actually will show some of their more modern performances here. A modern performance of a very old song here, because I think they're still fairly in touch with like what the fan favorites are from back in the day. Like everyone loves this one. They still compose music for Falcom games and are credited as a unit, not particularly as individuals, and probably have the largest catalog of music available as a result, I would say. And like I said, they have more members than you can count. But unlike other house bands, JDK doesn't, they do play concerts, as you can see here, but back then they didn't as much.
It's also like a confusing situation where like they had a subunit to do bands
it's very
concerts.
Strange, because they have these long-standing limits on employee identification and promotional activities, which was not really that rare for game companies at the time. So instead, like JDK, the team who maybe composed the songs, were not JDK Band, the group performing the songs. So they kind of like kept a separation of interests for whatever reason. And so I'm not sure if they operate under these same restrictions today particularly. I feel like they maybe might have broken out of that a little bit, but back in the day it was very strange and convoluted. They were formed by King Records in collaboration with Falcom in 1990, and it's a bunch of freelance musicians that were contracted for these live performances and arranged albums to help promote Falcom's games. Like if you go back far enough, the original Falcom JDK albums, you can find like rock guitarists who have played with like major Japanese rock artists who have nothing to do with games at all, who were like credited on some of these old albums.
Yeah, I think it was someone from Emotion, like the Japanese heavy metal band, who came on to like help them out for the Xanadu OVA.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And a few of their members early on, they came from Emotion, which had done opening and ending themes to the Xanadu OVA. The original incarnation of the band disbanded in '94, but in 2007, JDK Band reformed with a new roster and sort of an increase focused on, they are definitely the most violins per capita of any of these groups that you've heard by a mile. And so they're a little bit, maybe not necessarily prog rock, but a little more like leaning in that direction to an extent, I would say, than maybe some of the other ones are. And there's kind of these I think, large, sort of vague rumors of ugly behind-the-scenes events that happened during the cancellation of the Japan Game Music Festival 2 in March 2015, and involving Falcom that led to JDK disbanding with a new lineup under the name JDK Band with all capital letters.
JDK Band Theta.
Yeah, Theta. I'm sorry. And so it's just a very strange, convoluted history. But I mean, was it?
That was a third roster question mark?
I think so.
Roughly.
Yeah, I feel like someone just needs to write an entire book on their history, to be honest with you. But I mean, most of those performances that you saw in their releases are still fairly current. So they still make appearance at like either TGS or like Tokyo Game Music Festival or whatever. So you can regularly still see them on stage doing events even now.
And I'm excited because we still have time on this to get into this fun topic. This is the Game Music Festivals. So this was something that ran from 1990 through 1995. And these were really, these were like an annual event, provided a venue for several of these bands to perform in like one long show, more or less. So this is where a lot of these bands had their live concerts. Sponsored by Kadokawa Shoten, you know,
The publisher.
the giant conglomerate there. The first one took place August 25th, 1990, and it just had Zuntata and SST Band, you know, everyone's favorites, right up front. And each year they just like kept adding more groups and like changing the lineups a bit. So like Elf Lila came on eventually for 93. I think they were there for 92 as well.
Yeah,
they were there for 92.
It gets very, like, you can definitely, at least on Japanese Wikipedias, read about the history of who all appeared when, and it's like it was a lot of mishmashing of like this band was here this year but wasn't here that year, and then they were back the next year and things like that.
Yeah,
but most of the bands we've talked about here made an appearance at some point at one of these.
At some point they all showed up, and like Zuntata, I think they were there basically every single one.
I think so.
Excuse me. There was some interesting like goof ups here in 1993 because Kadokawa Shoten's vice president Fumihiko Kadokawa resigned and formed a different company, MediaWorks, in 92. He took with him most of the Kadokawa staff that worked out of his office. So they sort of like took their part of the folder for the Game Music Festivals with them. So both companies ended up running one version of the Game Music Festival in like 1 month apart. So you had like a 3-day one in July, and then you had another one over 2 days in August. It's very, very interesting. There's only the only recording of that particular year were on a 500 copy cassette like promotional run that they sold at these events, and thank God someone uploaded the audio online, because good luck trying to find one of those. But yeah, I think their last SST Band's last performance was at the 93 show.
It was.
94 show was very interesting because they got it was jointly sponsored by both companies, so it was just one thing, thank God. And it was the sole appearance of SNK's house band, the Neo Sound Orchestra, and they put out their own live album on there, which is on Spotify for some reason. But it's great. Like, it's a great performance. You can also find the 92 show on CD, like select tracks from each of the bands that performed.
It makes me wondering what the licensing around that is like nowadays. Like, it's just like the bands just own their own performances or whatever. Like, it's strange because like a VHS was released, I think, for, I don't remember exactly which year it was, but one of these years a VHS was released for, and like, but not for all of them, only for one specific year.
And, you know, I think Zuntata and SST put out, like, Laserdisc and VHS versions of some of their performances, too. The last one of these took place in September 95, and it was, like, a mixture of anime and video game music. It had, like, a really weird lineup. Like, they had... a chunk of it was, like, promoting a recent visual novel, if I remember, which I did not write down in the notes, but it's very odd. very strange thing. But game music, the house band's era ended. The bubble had burst at that point in the Japanese economy, and I think maybe there was just not that same degree of money in it, and obviously things were changing. And
tours are expensive, man.
Tours are expensive. These people have to take time off of their composition duties. The game industry in general was going through a real contraction in the mid '90s, a near crash, as some have put it. And I mean, Data East, the reason their band disbanded is because the company was falling apart and closed up in '99.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a company's game music house band, what are you going to do without a company anymore?
Yeah, so there's that. But they sort of led to this interesting legacy in an interest in game music and remixing game music and arranging it. And while that may have petered out a bit in terms of a standalone product, you see that sort of move on beyond. Obviously, as games moved to a CD format, you didn't need to do these sort of standalone arrangements. You could just do a nice arrangement on the disc itself. If you didn't want to do that, I mean, there would be fans who would do it for you, really. I mean, OC Remix started up, late 90s, 98,
something like
99.
That, yeah.
And they're still going. They're still putting out remixes of stuff. People have been doing stuff outside of the OC Remix ecosystem. You can find a million remixes for basically any song on YouTube.
Oh, yeah.
And MAGFest, there's a lot of cover bands that perform these songs, and a lot of them come to MAGFest. A lot of the actual bands come to MAGFest. I feel like even though the house bands as like a concept is done for the most part, like there's still things going on carrying that torch.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll specifically call out, the image that I put on the last slide here is I'm sure at least some of you here are aware of the Mikado arcades in Tokyo. They're like weirdly a hub for like Japanese game music, sort of cover bands. And cover bands is even doing them a little bit of disservice because some of them have contributed to actual game soundtracks. But like Phantom Iris here, for example, does like monthly streams from Mikado where they just do like absolutely amazing covers of music from almost any game genre you can think of, from arcade games to RPGs. So like Mikado is like very wonderfully like fostering that sort of attitude.
I was gonna say Raiden 3 and 4 got reissued with
Phantom Iris was all over those soundtracks. Heavy Metal Raiden was all over those soundtracks.
Yeah.
And I mean,
Mikado mixes.
Yeah, and we've got like a lot of cool, like sort of modern day examples of this, which are like kind of not really the same, but kind of the same. Like we gotta have some Final Fantasy 14 people here, right? I'm sure, probably. You got the Primals, Masayoshi Soken's band at Square Enix, who really is kind of this. Like some of those guys are hired musicians and not Square employees or whatever, but they're making music for a specific company and even like a specific game, right? Everything they do is for Final Fantasy 14. You've got a really, really great Persona live band who tours from time to time. For a while, it was every year or every couple years. And they do just really, really amazing arrangements of these songs. And they have, DVDs and Blu-rays and things you can buy for like a handful of concerts at this point. We had Takenobu Mitsuyoshi, who we mentioned earlier, is still at Sega, and he's still he's maybe not as active as he used to be. Like most people who have been around a company for a while, he's probably more in like a mentoring or like management role or something, but like you'll still hear him release stuff for games sometime. I think he did something they released something for the upcoming VF game, I'm pretty sure, that he sung. Maybe
I think he was on the trailer.
Yeah, even featured it in the trailer as well. So like he had like a dinner show that I was supposed to go to, and then the pandemic happened and it just sort of turned into an online thing. So he like does these weird one-off events. There's like a Sega Sound Street or something like that channel that is again sort of like their version of like the Zuntata talk show that sometimes he sings on as well. And you've got even more, I would say, sort of like underground stuff like that. Probably no one here knows Kick the Can Crew, a Japanese hip-hop unit who still exists today but was sort of around in the mid-2000s. One of their members, MCU, has like a little group called Family Continue that does like hip-hop versions of like songs. The Gradius thing that you may have heard opening the pre-show today was him. So you can find like Family Continue on YouTube and hear like some really cool hip hop versions of that stuff as well. And that's kind of all we had. To be honest, we ended a little bit earlier than I thought we would.
It's better than trying to cram in 10 minutes of material into 30 seconds like last year.
So,
but we can take questions.
Yeah, or if anybody has favorites.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh. Okay. No.
I'm pretty sure I used that spreadsheet for the podcast even.
Oh, did you?
This is my bell, like, unfortunately.
What's that? Yeah, this is Retronauts. They have a website and they have all sorts of fun stuff.
Yeah, so get back to JDK Man. The JDK Man slide. Yeah, just navigate for all. Sorry.
He's totally taking.
Bouncing left and right.
All right.
Yeah, there we go.
Just let me know
All right.
the minute he gets over.
There were, so as mentioned earlier, there were 3 different iterations of JDK Band. The initial one was headed up by Toshihiko Kishimoto in the turn of the 90s. And after a big period of inactivity, they reformed around 2007 through the connections by the arranger Yukihiro Jindo, who had worked in TV commercials and scoring for a bunch of different programs by that point. This is around when Falcom was starting to do more work with live. They wanted to do more live music like they did back in the start of the 90s before the bubble burst, around when the bubble burst. So they got a bunch of very talented session musicians, some of whom had come from the doujin music scene. For instance, Masaru Teramae, the guitarist in the middle right there, is actually very well known for being the main guitarist for a Toho music group called Demitori. And if you ever listen to one of their YouTube recordings or live concerts, you would understand just how talented these people are. And they're working entirely with this open source community tracks based on works by Zune for the Toho games. And together with arranger performers like Toshiharu Okajima on drums and Noriko Kamikura on keyboard, they did a variety of not just arrangement albums like you would normally see back in the 90s, but now for more modern music from series like Trails in the Sky and East and a bunch of pretty well-known stuff now. In the early 2010s, they decided to expand this. They actually had a series of live broadcast streams on Nico Nico Doga, the Japanese streaming video provider. This was just called JDK TV. It would just be usually Kaneko Kotera, the vocalist, and either Okajima or Kamikura, and often Teramae. They would just get into a little booth and do these recordings. They would play unplugged versions of Nihon Falcom tracks from various sources. They would go all the way back to, say, the earliest East 1 and 2, all the way forward to, say, Trails from Zero, basically covering the wide swath of different live album material that they had over time. Basically, this iteration of the group ended around 2012 and 2013 due to varyingly reputable internal politics. The people on the spreadsheet, as I mentioned, that I helped run with the runner of Falcom Music Channel on YouTube, I've been trying to track down as much reputable info on what happened in the last series of concerts that got kind of truncated. There was a set of legal accusations flying between Falcom leadership and the talent contractors they were going through with. They were working with.
There's a reason we didn't delve into it too deeply.
It gets messy.
I don't want to get into the legal morass
Right.
because I don't want to, trip over something that could set off a landmine.
Their third iteration, JDK Band Theta, they do regular shows now, and they are not the same. Essentially, Okajima Kamikura, for instance, they worked with Jindo helping to arrange Sound Team JDK's music, Sound Team JDK being the internal sound team at Falcom. These are the main composers and arrangers. They're just in the office all the time. And they had a very strong working relationship up until around the mid-2010s. Some of these musicians have gone on to work on arrange albums for, say, Atlas series like Etrian Odyssey in the meantime. And there is a strong through line between Atlas and modern Falco music as a result of that. That's my piece.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Some additional JDK lore for you. Does anyone else have any questions or? I saw you first, and then we'll do you. Okay, yeah, we can throw on the first couple slides. You, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, thanks for the panel. What distinguished other than mostly being point-off companies, like what distinguished the Japanese developers that chose to pursue this? Like there's some notably absent huge companies like Nintendo and Square and whatnot that didn't have these touring groups like you described.
From my perspective, my feeling is that it was companies that had these sort of existing arrangements with the companies that were producing albums, particularly like GMO stuff. Namco is the weird outlier here because Namco was pretty prevalent in GMO materials, but they never had a house band.
I don't know why they never decided to go down that road. I mean, I'm sure they've certainly had like arranged albums, but I'm guessing that was just like, we'll hire some musicians and call it a day and not care about having like a persistent, Namco band or whatever.
But like, I don't think Nintendo was really putting out
no, that's true.
a lot of stuff through the same sort of channels that these bands were.
And I'm kind of cycling through these for people who kind of missed the slides here.
Yeah. Does anyone else have anything? Or are we good? I think we are.
We're not good because you said Darius wrong.
And Kage wrong.
That's a cave. That's what I grew up with. That's what I'm going to remember.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming.
One last one. Hold on, we got one last one.
Oh, we got a last one?
It was you.
Yes.
When I think about the end of the bubble period and the investments that came through Japanese studios at the time, especially for, you got a wide range here of large arcade manufacturers, but also you got Falcom. They're mainly a home computer and a console developer. And my question really comes from, it really revolves around why do all these groups generally dissolve kind of asynchronously, but usually when they did dissolve, it's because they all did it all at once.
Yeah.
It's always money, but no more money. But it's almost in the bubble.
Do you think it was like someone did it first, and then like as you often see with businesses, it's like, oh my God, SST broke. Why are we still having like a house band? This costs too much money. We gotta, I feel like it might have just been a little bit of that, but it's hard. I feel like to say like absolutely for sure.
Yeah, without delving into probably Japanese trade periodicals about Kadokawa,
And then, I mean,
Shoten,
Japan is always
Japan
Japanese companies, as we all know, are not great about disclosing reasons for things. So sometimes it's just like, it happened. No, we're not going to tell you why. You'll just have to make up reasons for yourself.
And hopefully they'll give clearance to someone to talk about it 30 years later.
Right. When somebody who was a former employee leaves or something and feels like they're safe.
And they still have to get permission, though, because it's company business.
It feels like there was a kind of the break the music club up mentality.
Yeah.
In these cases, like without Lyra, all these musicians dispersed.
Did their own freelance stuff, pretty much. And that's kind of the way of it now, right? Like most of the talented sound people are all freelance.
Right.
I feel like you're probably treated better versus being like a salaried employee in a Japanese company.
Especially Konami.
Yeah. No having to work in the gym or whatever.
You don't want to work as a janitor at the health center? Thank you. Like we said early on, we got books if you want to peruse, but otherwise, thank you all.
Thank you.